First, I would like to thank you all for coming on behalf of the Robert F. Kennedy Center. So welcome to the RFK Center. Thank you very much for your interest in today's discussion, which will be on the upcoming Egyptian elections. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Robert F. Kennedy Center. The RFK Center was founded in 1968 to realize Robert F. Kennedy's dream of a more just and peaceful world. And today, the RFK Center strives to achieve his vision by partnering with human rights leaders all over the world, teaching social justice, and advancing corporate responsibility. The RFK Center's core programs focus on the power of the individual, working with alliances and organizations to generate change. And we do this by conducting advocacy on a variety of human rights issues. We also conduct human rights litigation, provide training and capacity building, and also conduct fact-finding delegations and public awareness campaigns. The RFK Center has been monitoring the events in Egypt closely because of the declining human rights situation, as evidenced by the continued use of military trials for civilians, mass arrest and trials, and the increasing restrictions on freedom of expression and assembly. The RFK Center will continue to follow up and follow the upcoming elections, as well as the upcoming Egypt representation before the UN Universal Periodic Review later this fall. And I'd also like to highlight that last year in 2013, the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award was given to Ms. Rajia Omran, who is a courageous human rights lawyer from Egypt that defends and provides legal aid for persons who have been arbitrarily detained, as well as works to advance the rule of law, women's rights, and also the freedoms of expression and assembly. And on that note, I would like to invite Santiago Canton, the director of the Robert F. Kennedy Partners for Human Rights program, to start the discussion.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. We have two great panelists today here to discuss about Egypt, taking into consideration the upcoming election next week. So after their presentations, we are going to have time for, hopefully, good timing for all of you to participate and ask questions to the panelists. So I will just move quickly to the two panelists, and you have, if you don't have the bio, I think everybody has the bio, so I'm going to waste time with that, so we can go straight to the discussion, and we'll start with Dr. Dalia Fahmy.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here today as we discuss an often misappropriated topic, the politics of gender in a transitionary moment, and the implications of this on social, political, and the economic future of Egypt and Egyptian women in particular in the coming phase. And so what I want to focus on today is women vis-a-vis the state, asking what does the state and state power mean for women and women's rights, and why is it important for us to understand the stakes right now as we enter what is supposed to be the end of a transitionary moment or the transitionary phase in Egypt, rather than a few years from now. And so what I hope to do today is frame this discussion in a historic and theoretical context, and then to make some suggestions about what we need to be aware of as we look towards the future, the very near future, especially in the next coming months when we're going to have the presidential and then a very important parliamentary election under a new constitution. And so while we all remember January 25th of 2011 as the start of the revolution, from the outset it did take a gender dimension, because it was on January 21st that a video posted by a student, Asma Mahfouz, in which she spoke straight to the camera and said, holding a sign, she was going to go out and protest and try to bring down the Mubarak regime. And she was going to reclaim the dignity and honor of her fellow Egyptians. And she said, as long as you say there is no hope, then there is no hope. But if you go down and take a stance, then there will be hope. And she challenges men in her video, and she says, I'm going to fight for your freedom. I'm going to fight for your dignity. And if you are real Egyptians, if you're real Muslims, then the least you can do is come down and defend my honor to fight for your freedom. And this is a real challenge to men. I'm going to return to this challenge, protecting dignity and honor, in a few minutes. And although those initial moments of the Arab Spring, we saw images of protesters from all walks of life, from all social strata, women across the ideological spectrum coming together and chanting for one hand with the aim of toppling a very deeply encrusted authoritarian leader. It was women who really were amassed on the front lines of the protests in Tahrir Square. And if you remember the initial images, many of them were women coming face to face with the riot police. But when the state decided to respond right away, their first targets were women. Women were subjected not only to attacks, but also having their chastity questioned, which Asma had kind of alluded to. When the military subjected 18 protested women to humiliating virginity tests, they were referred to as not daughters of the nation. They're not awlad nas. They're sleeping in tents with men. They don't represent your country. These are the kinds of people, unchaste young women, that are calling for your rights. And this was a direct attack at the heart of society, triggering the call for social dignity and maintaining the status quo. Those girls in the street, those so-called revolutionaries, are not real Egyptians. Again, question of identity. And of course, we can't forget the young woman that became known as the Blue Broad Girl, who was beaten and stomped on by helmeted riot police, becoming the symbol for Egyptian protesters calling for an end to military rule. She became a graffiti image over time, and her position became elevated to Sitt al-Banat, or translated very loosely, kind of the epitome of womanhood. And through this and other representation, women began to reinscribe their victimization as resistance against dictatorship, and the process of redefining what the authentic Egyptian sense of womanhood was going to be in the coming phase. This wasn't the first time that the state had responded by targeting women. In 2005, the Mubarak regime had strategically begun to use this sexual violence against women. On May 25, 2005, what becomes known as Black Friday was a day of protest against the national referendum to renew the presidential term of President Hosni Mubarak. The state responded by having security officers attack the 3 most prestigious protesting female journalists, which led them to be stripped of their clothing in front of the journalist syndicate. Remember, 2005 was a very historic political moment. This was a time of political opening. This was a time where ultimately the Muslim Brotherhood won 22% of the parliamentary seats. So in this critical political opening, we see the repression of women as a very specific targeted use to instill fear in people. When we can attack your women, the bearers of cultural identity in society, your mothers, your daughters, your sisters, and you can't do anything about it, this is the heart of authoritarian patriarchy, social control. And here we see this as through targeted attacks on women. And in this case, the message was not only to society, but it was to the press, and silencing the independent media from critiquing by targeting female journalists. Now, why does the state target women in any protest movement, even if the protest doesn't have a gender dimension? It's because attacking women in this regard is a form of social control. If the state can attack women, 3 journalists in a sea of men, then ultimately society is powerless. And this is part of that very pathology of authoritarianism that had existed in Egypt, a pathology of authoritarian control that is perpetuated through state patriarchy. We all remember the then President Hosni Mubarak's interview with Christiane Amanpour on February 3rd, 8 days before his removal from office. He kept saying, "You don't know these people like I know them." And this is part of that very same pathology. The society needs to be controlled, and I'm the one to do it. And so, as I mentioned, the sexualized violence is used as a weapon of control in 3 primary ways: to humiliate, to instill fear to stop protests, and to intimidate and silence the media. And so what we're seeing today is during the emergence for the fight for democratic rights, an exposure of how social control is actually embedded in this authoritarian patriarchy of dominance of the public sphere that underscores many of the contradictions women are facing in Egypt today. And while the literature on women as social agents of political and social change highlights these struggles as negotiations over constructions of gender, women as symbols of protest find themselves caught between 2 major struggles. By becoming symbols of change, they're also perceived as symbols of instability. And think about this. Women as symbols of change becoming social symbols of instability, are caught between this duality. And as symbols of change and consequently instability, women become the targets of the state, not only for dominance but control of society. Egypt has historically done this on another level, through the Egyptian legal code. And I know Sahar is going to speak a little bit about this, but it's really in the dimensions on the personal status laws where negotiations of state-society relation have taken place. Issues of marriage, divorce, child custody. Interpreted laws are the place that become the site of contestation between people and the state. And in the historic 2000, the last 2000 changes that were made to the personal status laws that provided for the first time of a woman to initiate a no-fault divorce, meaning that a woman could finally be free of marriage that her husband had kind of bound her to. The historic change was challenged on the grounds that it would change the nature of society, that would alter the family, that would undermine the family, and subsequently undermine society. And the state media representations covering the new law were depicting women pulling their husbands on dog leashes, men pushing baby carriages, and cartoons aiming at altering society through an understanding that social upheaval is going to occur if women are granted more rights. And again, it's only in this notion of this position of personal status law that negotiation between state-society relations had been occurring. So we see that here women in Egypt have an interesting relationship to power, but it's not just relegated to Egypt or to the Middle East. It occurs here in the United States as well. The more women become active, challenging male-dominant authority, the more they become suspect or suspect citizens, because they're challenging this dominant authority. Women's activism over the years had led them to be accused of being social agitators, bringing down the family, bringing down morality, and attempting to undermine state power ultimately. And in many ways, activist women here, even in the United States, have been referred to what my colleague calls suspect citizens. Women who, in their attempt to be active members of democracy, are seen as undermining this. And we see this as the narrative against, for example, Code Pink, or the more recent articulations against candidates of being empty dresses. Why is this all important for us to focus on today as we move toward the next phase? Because under the current transition regime led by the presidential candidate Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, state violence against women is at an all-time high. And the targeting of women protesters has not just moved from the public, but also to previously protected spaces, like university campuses. The last November sit-ins and the new protest laws last protest law by non-Islamist group, No to Military Trials, was violently dispersed. Protesters included many women who were brutally beaten in the streets, and the women were taken into police custody, arrested, physically abused, and taken to remote places and then ultimately dumped in the middle of the desert. Al-Azhar University has been a major battleground of contesting the state through protest, resulting in the largest number of dead and detained students. 184 students have been killed, 1,800 students have been arrested, and female student involvement has made them the subject of violent repression by security forces. And during one protest, 3 female students were shot dead, and 98 others were arrested. Arresting and trying female political activists was not as commonplace during Mubarak's repressive era, yet more recently it has become routine. Last November, we all remember, 21 women, younger than the age of 23 years old, 7 of them being children, were sentenced to 11 years in prison for peacefully demonstrating as part of the Girls of 7 o'clock in the Morning movement. And even though those harsh sentences were repealed, the message was clear. The regime was not going to back away from intimidating and punishing anyone who dared to challenge it. The interesting dimension of this movement of the so-called Girls of 7 o'clock in the morning is that state media pundits started calling these fully clothed, white-veiled girls worse than women of the night. The argument was that women of the night, or prostitutes, are harming themselves, but girls coming out in the morning were causing instability and ultimately harming society. They were accused of fitna, a religious term for creating discord in society. So we see women's chastity questioned in very religious, social, and political terms as agents of change. The basic relationship between gender and politics is important to remember because analysts often segregate women's issues from others and consider gender dynamics irrelevant to social change. Similarly, gender is all too easily reduced to women, rather than a functioning as an inclusive category of analysis of how social roles are constructed by individuals and institutions that are shaped by them. An exclusive focus on women tends to neglect the extent to which women are actively engaged in other integral social movements, including grassroots activism that may not be explicitly gendered, or to ignore the extent to which women are absent from political mobilization, including parts of the youth protests, which are overwhelmingly male. The model of women patiently suffering or heroically resisting a universal, unchanging patriarchy may have been pushed back in many parts of the world to accommodate a more specific dynamic analysis. But this is part of the Orientalist interpretation. This limited intellectual framework is inadequate for a serious understanding of contemporary women's lives, gender relations and politics, and whether formally or informally, and whether they occur in the Middle East or elsewhere. So how is gender relations related to revolutions and to the future of Egypt? If gender is a social construction of sexual and social difference experienced through daily practice and conventions as well as institutional enforcement, then the relationship between gender and politics is fundamental. And yet gender saturates political relationships and the subjective identities of all political actors. Particularly during periods of revolutionary upheaval, gender norms become redefined. And if the state is itself under threat by protest, then so is the family order that is articulated by the very state. So state patriarchy is not unique to Muslim majority societies, and patriarchal authoritarian states are not exclusive to the Middle East. Patriarchal social values can exist even within democratic societies. But when they do exist within democratic societies, they will inevitably come under pressure and be redefined as the democratic process grows and continues through state policies. So formal elections themselves are not sufficient for democracy. When democracy is understood not only as a system of government, but also as a form of pluralistic negotiation among citizens, then this can be redefined. To the extent that any group understand themselves as exclusively entitled to determine state policy for all, which is what's happening in Egypt today, then democracy is in question, or the quality of it is in question, because true inclusion of the vision of the future is absent. Similarly, the extent to which the patriarchal social order accepted and naturalized within the political framework, democracy and citizenship ultimately become incomplete. In Egypt today, the political and social marginalization of women, minorities, and youth are a product of the very patriarchal political structure that exists. And when the presidential candidate, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, an increasingly patriarchal authoritarian leader, states that it will be women, the mothers of the nation, that will elect him into power, he's further setting up Egypt and Egyptian women for a patriarchal political structure that redefines their role in society and ultimately redefines what patriarchy is going to be, undermining the very essence of the revolution that began with. So I'm going to stop here, but hopefully in the Q&A we can flesh this out a bit more.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, Dalia. And I'm sure there are a lot of questions. At least I do have a lot of questions already, but let's move on to Sahar.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to Lydia for her and Brian for their excellent organization of the panel, and thank you to Santiago for the invitation. First, I just want to give a brief introduction about an organization that I work with and I'm very proud to have co-founded, called the Egyptian American Rule of Law Association. And we meaning Egyptian American lawyers and policy experts, started the organization about 3 years ago, right after the January 25th uprising. And we have been diligently and trying to remain optimistic, despite the tumultuous last 3 years, in supporting rule of law reforms and assisting those on the ground in Egypt that are trying to reform the various aspects of the legal system. So you can imagine, for those of you who have been paying attention to what's happening, that's been a very difficult task. But if you want to know more, you can look it up at www.earla.org, erla.org. So I'm going to use my time to give more of a legal analysis of the new election law, presidential election law, as opposed to a political analysis, but we can save the Q&A for that. And I'm doing that mainly because I feel that the discourse is flooded with political analysis, but I don't think there's enough discussion about the laws that underpin the politics. So first, in terms of election laws, there are 4 statutory laws that govern elections in Egypt, and some of them are being amended, and some of them remain the same and need to be amended. So the first is Law Number 73 of 1956. That's the law that governs the former, well, it still exists, the Higher Election Commission and political rights. And Law Number 38 of 1972 governs the People's Assembly. Law Number 120 of 1980 governs the Shura Council, which is now defunct. It is no longer in existence. That was essentially the higher body in the parliament that had no legislative authority and was essentially a place where the president could appoint many of his cronies. So many people didn't shed any tears when the Shura Council was abolished after January 25th. And then Law Number 174 of 2005, which governs the presidential elections, as well as the Presidential Election Commission. So the recently promulgated law is it's a presidential decision because, as you know, Egypt has not had a parliament since June of 2012, right before former President Morsi was democratically elected. So during his entire tenure, he did not have a parliament, and until this day, there's no parliament. So any law that has been passed since June 2012 has been by presidential fiat. Similarly, between February 11th, 2011 until the middle of January 2012, which was when the first democratically elected parliament was put into place, similarly, you had anything passed within that period was by presidential fiat, in this case, the Supreme Council on Armed Forces. And the reason why that's important from a legal perspective is that these are laws or decrees that have no representation by the people. They were essentially promulgated and executed by one branch of government. Okay, so I want to highlight 2-3 issues when we're talking about the presidential elections that are coming up on May 26th and 27th next week in Egypt. The first point is that, in my opinion, voter turnout will tell us a lot more about the legitimacy of the elections as opposed to the high percentage that former General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is inevitably going to get. I think it's pretty clear that he will be getting probably in the 80th, maybe in the 90th percentile, because I believe those who don't support him just won't go out and vote. Some people will go out and vote for Sabahi, but there's quite a bit of disenfranchisement and the voter turnout's going down. So it will be very interesting to see. And I'm not necessarily predicting, I am predicting a lower voter turnout, but I think that the lower it is, the more it tells us about the absence of legitimacy of these elections. And the most recent survey we have was conducted by the Egyptian Center for Public Opinion Research, also called Basira, in March of this year. It found that 72% of respondents would vote for Sisi, 2% for Sabahi, and a quarter reported to be undecided. So assuming that's accurate, that gives you a little bit of insight into the state of affairs about 2 months ago. The second issue I'll focus on are key election laws provisions and be a bit kind of engage in a legal analysis to tell you where I think there is room for fraud or violations of the law, just things to look out for. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit very briefly about the next parliament, because I think a key point in the next regime is going to be the relationship and the powers between the president and the parliament. And so it may very well be that this presidential election is flawed insofar as how it came about and how rushed it was and kind of everything that's happened in the last 9 months. But if you have a relatively independent parliament that isn't in the pocket of the president, there may be some hope for some healthy democratic contestation and some representation of a more diverse group of people within Egypt. But again, we still don't know, it's hard to predict that. But that's something, that relationship from a legal perspective is very important. So just to give you a context in terms of voter turnout. So in 2012, the presidential elections that ultimately got Mohamed Morsi into power, barely, he retained a little over 51% of the vote. So it was a very close vote with Ahmed Shafiq. The turnout was 51.5%. If you compare that to the 2005 presidential elections in Egypt, that was 23%. So that is a double. You've doubled the voter turnout. That's quite significant in Egypt. If you want to compare it to the United States, not that I think those are two comparable societies by any means, but since we're in the United States, it might be an interesting point of comparison. In 2004, the voter turnout here for presidential elections was 60%, compared to 23% in Egypt. In 2008, that was when Obama was running, it was 62%. That was one of the highest for presidential elections. And then in 2012, it was 58%. So if Egypt continues with the 51% and maybe higher voter turnout, that is quite impressive. And it is at the level of at least this Western society that has a pretty deep history of a democratic process. And that's, again, one reason why I think it's important to pay attention to the voter turnout, and it reflects also a level of engagement and belief in the system. The 2012 parliamentary elections, 59% turnout. This is in Egypt. The constitutional referendum that Morsi very controversially pushed through, arguably illegally, that was a 32% turnout, so that dropped quite a bit in Egypt. Compared to the 2014 constitutional referendum of this January, which was also very problematically passed and rushed because there was minimal, if any, representation of the Muslim Brotherhood. That one was 38%, so a little bit higher. And the 2005 parliamentary elections, 28%. So as you can see, the numbers in the before January 25th are in the 20th percentiles. And then they went up into the 50th, low 50. And then they went down into the 30th when we're talking about either what we'll call Morsi's constitution or Sisi's constitution, depending on, for shorthand. So that gives you a little bit of perspective, and we shall see. Those who didn't turn out to vote in this past 2014 constitutional referendum, most of them were the youth or those who were in favor of the former President Morsi and opposed to what happened on July 3rd, which is being called a military coup by some, or a second revolution by others, or a popularly supported military coup by others. So, but it was obviously a turning point in Egypt's post-January 25th experiences. Okay, so then let's focus on the key election provisions, and you'll have to, excuse me, I'm going to get a little bit legalistic, but I think it's important to highlight where things can go wrong. There's many ways it can go wrong, but the first, which I think is a positive point, is that now the Presidential Election Commission is composed only of judges. This is important because historically, the what we call the PEC, the Presidential Election Commission, or the HEC, the Higher Election Commission, which used to oversee the parliamentary elections, was often composed of a combination of political appointees under the Ministry of Justice and judges. And oftentimes the Ministry of Justice appointees essentially politicized the entire process and facilitated election fraud. And so there was a belief, and there still is a belief, although that is now being challenged in Egypt, that if you put judges in charge, you will have a more independent process. And so for many reasons, the Egyptian judiciary is viewed as relatively, and that's the operative term, relatively more independent than other government institutions, particularly executive branch institutions. So Egyptians have been pushing for that, reformists have been pushing for that. So the 5 members of the PEC are the President of the Supreme Constitutional Court, who serves as chair, the President of the Cairo Court of Appeals, the most senior deputy of the President of the Supreme Constitutional Court, the most senior deputy of the president of the Court of Cassation, and the most senior deputy of the president of the State Council. So those are the 5 judges that essentially control the monitoring and oversight of these presidential elections. Now, the caveat with the term independent is that, as you all may have read, there have been some very controversial judicial decisions in the last month or two, where people who are alleged to have engaged in violence, whether through riots, whether through killing, and many of them are also accused of being pro-Morsi and anti-July 3rd or anti-Sisi, have been charged in mass, have been convicted in mass, sometimes mass death sentences with very minimal due process, 1 or 2 judicial hearings. That is, from any kind of international best practices perspective, highly problematic. I don't think you can ask any lawyer or judge worth their salt, including in Egypt, that can you give 127 people, can you give 683 people, can you give 500 people due process rights in that context for such serious allegations, and particularly when you're dealing with death penalty cases? The answer is no. That's not to say that they may not be, that they're guilty or innocent of the charges. It's just that one cannot know. Those are not the types of outcomes that one can feel safe are a product of a legitimate process. So that has caused some suspicions about the independence of the judiciary and some questions as to, is this a reflection of individual judges who have perhaps internalized their own political viewpoints in a way that's inappropriate, or is it a reflection of a systemic problem? It leaves a lot of open questions. And ultimately, it has become ammunition for those who are convinced that the judiciary is not independent. And so it'll be interesting to see how the judiciary responds in terms of preserving its own legitimacy, because it has an institutional interest in doing so. Because then all the decisions coming out of the judiciary will be subject to question whether they're political or not. They could be economic, commercial cases, family law cases, et cetera. Okay. And so in terms of what the primary duties are of the PEC, I'll focus on some of the key points and highlight where things can go wrong. So they are overseeing the preparation of the voter registration database, and that's based on the data from the National Identification Number records. That's very important because if the there are many countries, I'm sure including in this country, where you have people that have died and their names are on the list, or people that actually don't exist that are on the list. So it's very important that this list is accurate, because that's one way that you can boost voter turnout. And you can have people voting that actually don't even exist. They supervise the voter registration process, and they also make sure that the candidates have equal access to state-owned media. So that's something to look out for those of you who are media experts. I'm not sure if anybody's done a study as to whether or not Sabahi and Sisi are getting equal access, but they are supposed to in terms of state-owned media. And that's the PEC's job. They're also tasked with governing involvement of local and international media and civil society organizations in monitoring elections. So they are responsible for authorizing who gets to be an election observer. And hopefully that will be done also, one would hope, in an objective and neutral way. Now, any voting challenges are made to the PEC, so they have a lot of power. If anybody wants to challenge some form of fraud, alleging fraud, or any kind of violations of election law, the PEC is the final arbiter. And this has created a lot of controversy because you cannot appeal their decisions. They are final decisions. And that is unusual. Normally, in many countries, you will have a commission, electoral commission, that is usually not comprised of judges. I mean, some countries will, but oftentimes they're not comprised of judges. And then they make decisions and they're appealed to the judiciary. And it will then go through the normal appellate process so that you can ensure there's always a higher level of review to ensure that no one is getting treated unequally or in a way that's inappropriately political. But in this case, that PEC is the one and only decision maker. The justification for that, and the argument is that this is in violation of Article 97 of the Constitution, which grants every citizen the right to litigation, to appeal administrative orders. So then you're getting into some legalese. So the interim president, Adli Mansour, has been quoted as saying a PEC decision is not an administrative order, it's a judicial order. And a judicial order, you do not have a constitutional right to appeal that. That's a semantical game that lawyers are trained to play. I'm not sure if everyone's persuaded. I still think it's a little bit risky to have the same organization that is doing the monitoring also has the power to make final decisions and has absolutely no oversight over it. Now, there is one problem, which is they are all members of the highest levels of the highest courts in Egypt. So I suspect some of the judges think, well, if you don't trust us, who will you trust? We're making the decision. But as a matter of due diligence, or I should say, as a matter of good process and administration of justice, even the best of judges can make decisions, can make mistakes, and so you should always have at least one level of appeals. And it could be their colleagues, and they won't be obviously on the case that if it's appealed to the judiciary. So that's one area that is, I think, ripe for some reform in the future and maybe a basis for some contestation. The other issue is what's prohibited. So what are the types of activities that are prohibited that you might want to pay attention to? And I don't think we'll have as much of a problem here, but it'll be interesting to see when the parliamentary elections start and things get really exciting. Because you're going to have, we've just heard, at least we have reports that the next parliament will be 600 people in one house, one house of assembly. So it will no longer be two bodies. It will just be the People's House of Representatives. So first is you cannot engage in campaigning activities that expose the private lives of any of the candidates. So that's similar to defamation, libel, slander protections. You cannot threaten national unity. That is a very, very broad and vague term that has been used and abused in the anti-terrorism context. You cannot use religious slogans or calls for discrimination against citizens. You can't use violence or threats to use violence. You cannot give donations, gifts, or in kind in exchange for votes. A lot of this is nothing new. The issue is about enforcement. You can't use buildings and facilities or that are owned by the state in order for your campaigning purposes. You can't spend public funds, nor can you spend the funds of civil society organizations and associations, which is interesting because that means that civil society is de facto barred from at least financially supporting candidates. And you also have to have, there's an anti-graffiti provision in here. If those of you who have been to Cairo, there's a lot of graffiti on the walls these days. That's been the alternative, I think, to not being able to protest in the streets thanks to the anti-protest law. So people become very creative in their forms of contestation. So you also cannot write anything on the walls of government or buildings, private premises for purposes of election campaigning or protest. Okay, so the other major issue, so those are the things that are prohibited. None of this is beyond the threatening national unity, which I think is problematic. It's all pretty standard. The question is, will it be enforced and will it be equally enforced, particularly when you're getting to the parliamentary elections, which will have a different law, by the way, that will govern it. This law I'm talking about strictly for presidential elections and the Presidential Election Commission. But a couple other very important parts of the law are who is going to be chairing the polling stations and doing the vote counting. So it's not judges that are voting, they're counting every single vote. There aren't enough judges. The judges are supervising the process and they're inside the polling station. And so the chair of each polling station has to be from a judicial body. And the problem is, what does judicial body mean? And in the United States, you think just the judiciary, just the judges. But in Egypt, because it's based on the French system, there is somewhat of a conflation or there's not as much of a separation between the public prosecutor's office and the judiciary. And so what you have are people who are public prosecutors who are actually members of the judiciary. The general prosecutor, which is equivalent to our attorney general, is a member of the judiciary. He is not a member of the executive branch, even though his job is to prosecute crime and other laws. So it's a very different type of relationship. And then public prosecutors essentially get promoted or move up and become judges and then move up through the system. And that's very standard. It's foreign to us in the United States. But I mention that to say that there are 4 units or 4 entities that could be judicial bodies, meaning that 4 employees of those entities could be overseeing the elections. Ordinary judiciary, okay, that's what we're accustomed to here, the public, which includes the public prosecutor's office, the administrative judiciary, which is essentially like administrative judges, but that also has a public prosecutor section, the Supreme Constitutional Court, and then something called the State's Lawsuit Authority, which appears to be primarily, again, lawyers that have an enforcement role. So the point here is that you are going to have there's a possibility that you will not have only judges in terms of sitting judges in a court, whether it's administrative, criminal, civil, family, that will be overseeing the voting. And that those who are working in a prosecutorial role as an advocate may have a conflict of interest. And the very point of having the independence of the judiciary, being overseeing the elections, may not be attained. So it's, again, just a point to keep in mind, and something that I think elections monitors should want to pay attention to. The other issue is the General Secretariat of the PEC, which is essentially the staff. And in the past, that has been managed by employees at the Ministry of Justice, and that was highly problematic. So even if you have the PEC are judges, the actual secretariat that does the work, that implements their authority and their mandate, if there are people running it that are from the Ministry of Justice or the Ministry of Interior, you're not getting what you think you're getting in terms of quote-unquote independence or detachment from the executive branch. And whether or not that is appropriate is something for the Egyptians to determine, but we just have to be clear about what it is the law says and what it's going to produce, as opposed to what it's being framed as. So hopefully that the General Secretariat is being led and managed by judges, if the objective is to have that independence. The other issue are auxiliary polling stations. So, for example, you may have in Cairo, Alexandria, and all the major cities, the judges are in fact the ones who are supervising the vote counting in the polling stations, and so you may not have the problem of a prosecutor doing the oversight. But then in the auxiliary stations, which is out in the rural areas, you will have people from the Ministry of Justice or the Ministry of Interior that will be managing it, and that was where a lot of the fraud was found. That was where you found high levels of ballot stuffing and voter repression and all kinds of violations that were illegal and not enforced. So, again, something else to pay attention. Who is monitoring the auxiliary polling stations? Who's actually in charge of them? Okay. Just a couple of other small things, but again, important. Opinion polls. In Egypt, it's very difficult to actually do polling in Egypt. Hopefully that's going to open up because I think that facilitates economic growth and democracy. But for opinion polls, whoever conducts one has to disclose information about the organization, the financing, who's financing the poll, the questions included in the poll, the sample size, its location, the methodologies applied, the data collection methods, the dates of conduct, the ratio of possible error, and no opinion poll can be conducted 5 days prior to the voting day and during voting. So that's very different than what we have here. I mean, polls are pretty much dominate in an election cycle, so something to keep in mind. In terms of election spending, campaign spending, the amount has doubled. So under the 2012 presidential elections, it was 10 million pounds. Now it's 20 million pounds. A donor can only give up to 2% of whatever the limit is, which is 20 million. So a donor can give about 400,000 pounds, which is around 55,000. It's about 7 to 1 right now, a little over. So that's another area that, if you're going to do monitoring or watchdogging, is to make sure that where's that money going. Now, interestingly enough, the law requires that each candidate has to open up a bank account and has to put all the money for the campaign in that bank account and has to take very careful accounting and engage in financial account reporting to the PEC. And any money left over, the PEC gets to keep, and they're technically supposed to redistribute it to the donors. I'm not sure if that's actually going to happen, but whatever money's left over, the candidates don't get to keep that money. So in theory, it's very strict. Of course, in practice is a different question. But as we all know, particularly in the United States, campaign financing is an important issue in terms of politics and democracy. If you are a foreigner or an expat that lives abroad, you cannot give money to a political candidate, presidential candidate. So any foreign country or entity, international organization, a foreign person, anyone that is not Egyptian, living in Egypt, at least that's their permanent resident, is prohibited from giving money. And the other issue that'll be interesting is, the laws is a little complicated in terms of where you can vote. The de facto is where you live. So your residence on your ID card is where you vote. However, there's some exceptions for that. And so, again, another area to keep in mind, because if you can vote multiple times, particularly if whoever's running the polling station doesn't make you put on the blue tape, then you won't have to. You can do it multiple times. Okay. And then let's look at the penalties, because this is where, again, the law looks great on paper, which is part of Egypt's history. Egyptian laws have been pretty strong on paper. I think if you're going to criticize the Egyptian legal system, it's really mainly in the enforcement. Lack of enforcement, unequal enforcement, disparate enforcement, politicized enforcement. In theory, you can be fined, or legally you can be fined for failing to vote. If your name is on the database of registered voters, I doubt that's going to be enforced. If you offend a PEC member, so if you offend any of the judges that are in the presidential election committee election commission, you can be in jail for no more than 2 years, and you can be fined for no more than 2,000 pounds, or a total of 5,000 pounds. You can also be penalized either through confinement or fee if you intimidate or threaten to influence the election process. If you conceal or destroy evidence, if you harass or threaten voters. So why am I saying all this? Because that's exactly what used to happen in most of the elections in the past. Is the 2005 elections, the 2010 were even worse, which some argue is what led to January 25th, 2011, or one of the tipping points, is that either you would have hired thugs by the political party, usually the National Democratic Party, which was the party that Mubarak, was elected by repeatedly. They would hire thugs that would go and beat people up outside the station. They would scare people away from coming. They would pay people to vote, or there would be Central Security Forces, the CSF, who would engage in violence. Oftentimes it happened outside the polling station. So inside you would have a judge, and outside you would have all this violence. And the judges would see it and would want to stop it, and the security forces says, once you step out, we can't protect you. Stay where you belong. That's in the polling station. So that was a very common tactic, and you'd have deaths every election cycle sometimes. I think in 2010, 13 deaths, maybe 10 in 2005. So it could get very violent in particular areas, whether it was in the city or in rural areas. But a lot of the voter repression was focused on districts where the National Democratic Party candidate was vulnerable to losing, and that the opposition, oftentimes the Muslim Brotherhood, had a really strong chance of winning. So all that is to say that the laws actually are pretty solid in terms of penalizing that behavior and making it illegal. It's just a matter of enforcement. And that's one reason why election monitoring is so important. That's one reason why the media having access to the election process is so important, because otherwise we will never know. The Egyptians won't know, and neither will the international community, and all that contributes towards the legitimacy of the elections. Okay, what I'll do is I'll wait for the Q&A to talk about the relationships between the parliament and the president, because I do think there is some interesting shifts in the balance of power between the president and the parliament. And as you may have read, there's also some increased powers within the military. And so there has been some reshifting. And with that, I will wait for Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sahar. Let me very briefly, because taking advantage of my condition of a moderator, put some facts over the table. We, as Lydia said, we've been following the situation in Egypt, particularly regarding these upcoming elections, and there are some, and we've done it, focusing on international standards for elections accepted by everybody in the international community, plus international human rights standards that have been accepted by Egypt. And we focus mainly on three specific rights: the right to assembly, the right to association, and the right to expression. Again, based on these are international human rights standards accepted by Egypt. And this is information that is publicly available and that you all know about it, but I think it's important to put it all together and to put it into context of what there is an estimate that approximately 16,000 people have been in prison. Since 2011, 16,000 people. And forces have constantly disrupt all the political opposition rallies and using live ammunition. The last one that we have information about was on April 14 at the Cairo University, where at least 2 journalists were shot and 3 students were shot. That's regarding freedom of assembly. Regarding freedom of association, we all know about the ban against the Muslim Brotherhood, and of course you all know that Muslim Brotherhood is the party that got 51% of the votes in the prior election. But also more recently, on April 28th, the April 6th youth movement was also banned, and they estimate, according to themselves, that they have 10,000 of members that are also part of the April 6th movement. Regarding freedom of expression, the Committee to Protect Journalists estimates that Egypt right now is among the top 5 worst countries in the world regarding the imprisonment of journalists. Approximately, while there were no journalists in prison 2 years ago, right now there are at least 16 journalists behind bars and up to 20 journalists that have been charged under terrorist charges. And again, it's among the top 5 countries in the world regarding the imprisonment of journalists. So these are some of the facts that we know that clearly affect the right to freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and freedom of association, that under any circumstances we all know that are critical to have a free and fair election. So to some extent, Sahar already, I believe, you mentioned that at the beginning of your presentation, but the question is for the two of you. Based on these facts, based on your knowledge, based on what you just presented, how all this affects the pre-electoral process, the outcome of the next election of next week, and the legitimacy of the future administration. And also one question more specifically on the issue of gender discrimination. To some extent, of the last few years, not only because of the changes in Egypt, but overall and because of the Arab Spring, there was some hope that there was going to be more space for advancing women's rights in the region and in Egypt in particular. And that's basically, and you had a wonderful assessment of what are your assessment of the problems of patriarchal societies and how it affects gender discrimination, how the impact on gender discrimination. So what's the road ahead, particularly in the case of Egypt, and if the next parliamentary elections could have any any impact on that? I mean, I know it's a very broad question, but if you can take some, just a little bit of time, and then we can open up the question to the floor. Thanks.
So if we think about what the coming weeks up to the presidential election, we already have a mass segment of society boycotting the election, seeing that participation means an approval of the massive human rights violation happening in Egypt today. If we look at the voter turnouts among the expat communities in the U.S. and France and parts of the Gulf, the kind of crowdsourcing information we have from Twitter was while it was 44% in 2012, it's about 4% today. Sahar already mentioned the Basira poll of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi having 72% popularity, while Hamdeen Sabahi has 2%. So, I mean, the writing is not just on the wall. We know who's going to become president. And so in many ways, voter turnout might be a way that we talk about quality of democracy here. But when voting is tied to, for example, having your work papers taken from you, or submitting your national ID card, or being fined, the number of people wanting to vote or even registering to vote is problematic. So I'm not sure that we're capturing a lot by looking at vote turnout. If we listen to the past interviews of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and also what he has said in the past year, we can hear that very authoritarian pathology come back, that he's had a dream, right, of leading this country. He refers to Egyptian people as, you are Nur Ainena, right? You are the light of our eyes. Everything I do is for you. He has very simple solutions to very complex problems, right? Energy efficient light bulbs for electricity crisis. Food shortages, maybe we should all eat a little bit less. This authoritarian narrative, again, is we're not having public discourse on what the problems are of the coming phase. In terms of the protest law, not only is the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, the banning of the April 6th movement, but just a few days ago we saw the indictment of Mahi Noor al-Masri and 8 people who were protesting outside of the trial of the police officers of Khaled Said. And who was Khaled Said? He was that young internet cafe owner who was brutally beaten up by the security apparatus that began the revolution. And so this woman and 8 of her friends were sentenced to 2 years in prison, and this just happened. In terms of of course, there's a difference between having laws on campaign and campaign finance and what can be done and the actual implementation of it. During the last constitutional referendum, we saw judges hanging posters, Judge so-and-so says yes to the Constitution. So judicial independence in this regard is not extremely independent, but judicial independence is there's a vested interest for the judiciary that's very separate from the executive. And so it's not judicial independence that leads to the rule of law and justice in society, but the kind of capturing and the enshrining of the power of this party. We're, in terms of campaign finance and monies appropriated, we're seeing former Mubarak crony capitalists pouring money, kind of not necessarily for personal campaigns, but to ensure their futures in the coming regime. I'm obviously a bit more pessimistic. I don't know if anyone saw my last article last week. I'm not even calling this Mubarak light. I'm saying this is a redefinition of what authoritarianism is. We're moving past the past. We're forging a new future that is enshrining authoritarianism tied to the deep state, tied to military rule, that is far from moving towards democratic inclusion, political party formation, and voicing of opposition. And I think the coming phase, the presidential election, further clampdown, and the parliamentary election that's supposed to occur in 2 months, that we have yet to see who the candidates will be, because I think Sahar and I were talking about this just today. We're starting to see the beginnings of what the parliamentary election candidate requirements can be. We're not going to get that great contestation that leads to competition, that leads to democratic reform. The reason why it's important for us to get this right now is that the initial Parliament is the one that's going to legislate and articulate what's in the new Constitution. And so if it's kind of the rubber stamp of the executive, then what we're going to see is an enshrining of military rule in many ways that undermines authority. Putting simple female quotas, of course we don't know what's happening yet, but if there's a quota on the number of women that have to be in Parliament as the way to get around this kind of removal of women from political participation, again, if they are not free to articulate their own independent platforms, it's another place where women can be co-opted by the state as rubber stamps, which happened with the NDP under Mubarak, right? There was a quota system that brought women into Parliament, but they were not articulating for women's rights, but saying everything's fine. I'm not quite sure what you're fighting for. Right. And so feminists had to actually find independent members, and I did a couple of interviews with them where one said, I couldn't believe I had to go to members of the Muslim Brotherhood to fight for divorce because they were willing to do on religious grounds and stand with us, and the female members of the NDP in Parliament would not.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I wanted to make a couple points related particularly to the question of authoritarianism. I agree with Dalia insofar as you have a very high risk, and we may be past using the term risk to using the term reality, of having many components of the old regime make a comeback. And so that could be the security apparatus, the police force, Ministry of Interior. That includes what we'll call the crony capitalists, which were essentially Gamal Mubarak's crew. I think many members, or we'll say leaders of the National Democratic Party, are probably trying to find a new space for themselves. The judiciary is certainly trying to protect its interests. I would hope that they do it in a way that doesn't compromise their ability to be neutral arbiters of the law. But I think it's pretty clear from the last year that the judiciary as an institution felt very threatened by the Muslim Brotherhood. And for reasons that are, in my opinion, clear. One is that the parliament, the first parliament that was elected, was predominantly what we'll call Islamists, for lack of a better term, those who believe that religion plays a role in politics in some form or fashion. So you had the Muslim Brotherhood's 47%, and the Salafis, who were the farther right Orthodox, another 20-something%. So about 70% of the parliament was dominated by those who what we'll call religious rights parties. And there was some discussion of abrogating and abolishing the Supreme Constitutional Court altogether, and that it shouldn't exist, and that its powers and authorities should go into the Court of Cassation. Well, that's not a very good way to get the Constitutional Court to like you. So that was a direct affront to that institution. Morsi also wanted to pass amendments to the Judicial Authority Law that, whether you agree with it or not, produced the outcome that anyone over 60 years old was going to have to be subject to mandatory retirement if they were a judge. That's 25% of the judiciary. So that was going to automatically eliminate 25% of judges and their jobs. And he also wanted to enforce a provision that had long been there, but he was going to bolster it, which would allow that 25% of the judiciary could be practicing lawyers, because right now there's a very narrow path to becoming a judge. You graduate from from college. It's an undergraduate degree. You become usually a public prosecutor, and then you become a judge starting from the bottom, and you move up through seniority. There's a lot of nepotism and cronyism in the process. There's some, internal housekeeping that needs to be done in terms of how you become a judge. But the point is, it's a very particular way. You don't just run to be one or apply to be one the way you do here in the United States or other countries. And so when you say I want to get rid of 25% of you and replace you with lawyers, that's code for I want to put my Muslim Brotherhood loyalists in. So there were some things that the former regime did. I'm not making a judgment whether it was right or wrong, but it happened, that created war of attrition, and I've written about this, between the judiciary and the Morsi regime, and that has, unfortunately, or the concern is that it has seeped into being beyond I want to protect my job and my benefits and my income, to I am now going to jeopardize perhaps the way that I rule on legal proceedings. And that's an open question. So I do think all that is to say that, yes, there are some institutions that are deeply enshrined that are trying to kind of retain power. And I think with Sisi coming to power, that to them is very comforting. And I think they see him as someone who's familiar and someone who will protect their interests. Just finally, in terms of gender, I think, they just passed a law, or well, the interim president, so not they, one person just passed a law with the assistance of the cabinet, which he appointed, that criminalizes sexual harassment, particularly in public, which has been a very big problem in Egypt for reasons that Dalia has talked about. But they're also taking away a lot. So they're giving a little, because the question is, will it be enforced? There's a lot of laws on the books in Egypt criminalizing all kinds of activities that should be criminalized, but it's not enforced. But what are they taking away? The right to protest. They're taking away the April 6th movement. They're taking away the Muslim Brotherhood as a political entity. They're taking away all kinds of very fundamental rights that affect women as much as they affect men. And then giving a little bit so that they can feed the international community and say, look, we passed this law, which I'm not saying the law is a bad law. It's great, but you've got to compare it with the big picture. And then finally, the way that this is, I think, going to be played out, and the way it was played out in the past is you'll have two parallel legal systems. And so the way that Mubarak was able to claim that he was democratic to the West, but be an authoritarian within his own country, is he created dual legal systems. And so you had the ordinary judiciary, and then you had the security courts, the military courts, the special courts. And if you were just an ordinary, regular case that didn't involve any political issue, you would go through that system. But if you had anything to do with assembly or speech or politics, elections, you would come into this parallel system where you had minimal due process, minimal transparency, and it was just the secret system. And that was why the emergency law was such a big deal for many of the youth revolutionaries and the reformers. They wanted to get rid of that emergency law that had been in place for 30 years, which allowed the president to do that. In my view, you should watch out for the next anti-terrorism bill, because in the new Constitution, Article 237, it says the state commits to fighting all types and forms of terrorism. And then there will be a law that organizes the provisions and procedures of fighting terrorism. First, how do you define terrorism? This is a problem we have in the United States, and it's a problem that I'm sure will be in Egypt and every country. If I can define terrorism to include political dissent without saying it that explicitly, then I can use anti-terrorism to remove unpopular speech. They do that here against Muslims in the United States, and I've written quite a bit about it. So it can be abused in any country. And so if you're going to use national unity, public discord, those types of words, and you connect them to terrorism, you can eliminate your political opposition very easily. So these are the types of things that kind of the devil in the details that are at least worth focusing on, because there might be a chance to do something about. Whereas, as Dalia said, the elections, we know who the winners are, or the winner is.
Thank you, Sahar. And these questions we have here, and then we go there. So please identify yourself, please.
Thank you. My name is Safi Hamid. I'm the president of Egyptians Worldwide for Democracy and Justice. Thank you for all Douglas and for your institute for organizing that. Mr. Cantor, you took my question, so I'm going to ask another question. And I'll address it to Professor Sahar Aziz. I want to talk about two things: contents and context. The question is about, we heard that Carter Center, although they are present symbolically at least, they had some reservation, and they publicly said that the ambience, the atmosphere, the context is not promising any true election or whatever you want to call it, appropriate election. I want you to comment on this, and also in terms of contents, because I don't know whether I heard you correctly. You said the good news is that PEC are all judges. To me, this is a disaster, because to me, and to anyone who may not know about the judicial system in Egypt, the contents is horrifying. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a citizen, and I'm observing, of course, from here, comparing. These are people who I think have a very questionable competency, as a professional, and we have seen it even in Mubarak's trial, that the judge didn't know how to speak even. In terms of ethics, and I think Dalia said something about those judges, how impartial they are, and how arrogant and corrupted. Many of them have embezzled land and money and so on. Zindi is a very well known. So I don't know whether having it all judges is good news to you, and why.
Let's take the other question now. So, yes.
Yes, my question first to Sahar is people lost faith in the justice system completely. How we can have justice or rule of law in Egypt nowadays when we have that? That's adding to what Dr. Safi said. That's the first question. Second question to Dalia and Santiago. The violation in human rights in Egypt is tremendous. We have somebody who killed people, Sisi, and people call him killer in Egypt, not me saying that. And people will fight that. People will not accept somebody who killed their own people to be a president. He will be a president, of course, because he coming on the tanks and everything. But now people already open their mouths and call him killer and blood-handed person. Besides, during his interviews, maybe Dalia mentioned that, he's saying clearly, I will rule the way I want. Even the parliament, the demonstration law has to stay. Even the parliament, if they oppose that. Then I don't have faith in that election, or I don't have any opinion about it because it's sham, all is sham. How we can fight that human rights violation, especially we have kids who been use electric on them and tortured in the prison until now. We have women and people, we have rape of women, rape of men, Muslim and Christian, Coptic in jail. How we can fight that? We need the help of Kennedy Center. Maybe in the future we can contact you. My name is Amin Mahmoud. I was the Center of Egyptian-American Relations.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think it's significant that the Carter Center is not going to participate in the elections monitoring. I've read there's some various explanations. One of them is because they're concerned about the politics and the context. Another is more technical, but maybe related to the first, which is they couldn't get their equipment in time, and it was stuck in customs for a very long time. And they're questioning whether that was deliberate, because it was stuck in there for so long that by the time it was finally released, they really couldn't engage in effective monitoring. And so it kind of de facto excluded them without telling them no. So I think it is, but yes, the Carter Center has come out and said that, I believe the term is, Egypt is on the precipice. So it's interesting to see how there is a major divide between the rhetoric within Egypt and the rhetoric outside of Egypt. And it's almost as if there's two different universes. And so you have the international community, from literally the entire international community, bringing up these human rights violations and saying this is facially highly problematic, if not outright a violation of international law and domestic law, Egyptian domestic law. And then you have people in Egypt who some have termed, the rise of fascism, that there's a mob mentality, some kind of hysteria where people are cheering these mass death sentences. They're cheering the torture when they hear of it. And there seems to be this loss of humanity based on the rhetoric, which I think to me is much more worrisome than the political divisions, and something that I've never seen in Egypt before. And I think that it's something that all Egyptians have to be very careful about, because it could make the country very violent, just as a general practice, when you no longer recognize the humanity of someone simply because they have a different perspective than you. In terms of judges being the head of the PEC, so everything is relative. The reason why in the past, so you may know about this, but in 1999, the Supreme Constitutional Court issued a seminal decision, something that really upset Mubarak and the National Democratic Party, which was that all elections must be supervised by a judge, because before they were supervised by executive administrators who, and if you're concerned about the judges, think about someone who works for the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Interior. They are literally stuffing and just signing ballots. And so when the court issued that opinion, that was the beginning of judicial oversight of elections. And then in 2005, there was a lot of fraud, as usual, in the elections, although actually the outcome was much more favorable to the Muslim Brotherhood, the biggest opposition party. I think they got like 88 seats, which was the most they'd ever gotten. But there was still a lot of fraud. And if you'll remember, Judge Ahmed Mikki, who used to be the head of the Court of Cassation, and Hisham al-Bastawiji, I think, Astawizi. And so they were, and there was another judge, a female judge, Nuha, I forgot her last name, Zini. They and the Judges Club made a very big deal about the fraud, and they used the opportunity to do their jobs the right way. And in terms of saying, no, we are not going to approve these election results. These are fraudulent election results. The reason why we're here is to make sure that it is not politicized and that it is fair and free. And so what you're seeing is that the judiciary is not monolithic. And there is divisions within the judiciary itself. I'm not sure where it stands now. In 2005, 2006, it was the reformist movement that was stronger. My understanding is that movement is now quite weak. As you know, Ahmed Mikki is being criticized, and he had actually, I think, been subpoenaed to testify. And so there's been a lot of harassment and Mahmoud Mikki and et cetera. So many of those who were affiliated with this reformist judicial movement that was admired internationally are now actually being subjected to repression. And there's surely more judges out there, but I'm sure they're very concerned about their jobs. And I mean, the situation in Egypt is not a very open situation right now for a lot of people. So I'm not sure, I don't agree with you that the entire judiciary is corrupted. I just think that the same struggle society's dealing with is being played out within the judiciary. And in terms of whether you want the judges as the heads monitoring elections, you have to ask yourself, who else will you have? You have to have an alternative system. I've written a paper in the George Washington International Law Review, and I argue that if you look at places like Ghana, and there's a couple of other examples I cite, is that you should have non-judges, but people who are independent, and that's the tough part. How do you find individuals who are independent, who are not bought off or who are not bribed, and they have an independent jurisdiction, they have an independent budget, they cannot be influenced by the executive branch or any political parties? Have them monitor, and then that is subject to judicial appeal. Because I don't think that it is the judiciary's job to be involved in any legislative or electoral process, because they're the judges. They're supposed to be independent from that process. But again, you're dealing with the cards you have. So historically, the judges were the best option the Egyptians had. So that's why you have more of an optimistic tone.
Thank you. I think it's not just the Carter Center. I think this week we also saw the EU election monitors. Their security can't be guaranteed. Their equipment is also stuck somewhere, and their medical equipment as well. So, monitoring of elections is problematic. The narrative of terror and how quickly it was absorbed by society, as Sahar was alluding to, is probably one of the most dangerous things, and also the lack of trust in democracy, which I'll get to in a few minutes. We saw the Muslim Brotherhood become called a terrorist organization late last year, but since the removal of Morsi, the terrorist acts have been, credit has been taken by Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, which just very recently was declared a terrorist organization. And so there's an interesting on what the target of the narrative of terror is. Is it actual state security, or is it political opposition? If we look at the loss of trust in the democratic process, remember in the 2000 election where for a couple of weeks we didn't know who the president was, And I remember being in graduate school, and there was like almost a crisis. Is there a problem with the process? Imagine in Egypt where the entire undermining of the democracy and trust in democracy being almost completely gone. We saw very quickly after the revolution, line after line in 5 different elections or referendum of people believing in the process. The fact that we're seeing lower turnout in the first referendum vote and then in the expat vote right now, there's a loss of trust in the process of democracy, and ultimately democracy being an output. And so we can start to see how the narrative of strong power or strong executive becomes very palpable to the population, which is part of that fascist kind of ideology that's taking place in society, where we're willing to eliminate segments of society for this thing called security. The fact that it was done so quickly through state media, through independent, pseudo-independent media, is very troubling. If we look at the Freedom House indicators, Egypt's declining on every single one. I think there's one that's the same as last year, but last year wasn't a great year either. And so if we're looking at where Egypt's headed, I know you want us to be positive looking, but it's not looking. It's not going to take us to where we think we should be 3 years after a revolution.
Just very briefly, I'm not an expert on Egypt, but your question on how to defend human rights in authoritarian regimes basically can be applied to any country, and there's not one magic solution to it, unfortunately. And it's a combination of several things. It's a combination of the work of international civil society, the work of intergovernmental organizations, the work of international organizations, and in my view, the most important one, the work of civil society internally in the country, when there are some openings, like in the case of Egypt. So that's basically, and we are willing to support and help in any way you can. We are running out of time, but we'll take one more question and we'll finish. You had a question too? No?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so let's take 2 questions, and please go ahead.
I find it interesting, the juxtaposition of the point of view, and I think my way of understanding what you're talking about is to compare it with the Soviet Union. They went through this revolution, as it were, and they failed to achieve democracy. Okay, and with all the ramifications to their civil society and culture for women and others that you would expect to see. And so it's not, if you look at through that lens, it's not very optimistic for Egypt. I think we're seeing a failed turn toward democracy, and we're looking at Musharraf or Noriega or some other variant of autocracy that may be benign or it may be deleterious. I can't predict, but it's not optimistic. So I guess my question is, what's the long term? If I'm even close to correct on where this is headed, is there a Putin in the future for Egypt that'll last for a couple of decades?
Thanks. Let's take the other question.
I'm Joe Sobnek. I got a bachelor's in international affairs at Columbia. President Obama was there. I write about Egypt on the Peace and Collaborative Development Network. I'm also in a pro-Obama group called Organizing for Action, but I only asked them to talk about the Palestinians, not Egypt, due to the tensions there. I had a question that either of the ladies could answer. By the way, I had heard the Carter Center had intended to send 10 observers, but maybe this equipment problem came up after I heard about that, and Putin didn't have a contested election, by the way. But I asked, I heard El-Sisi was talking to Secretary of Defense Hagel. Can El-Sisi talk honestly to Americans about his political system, where on one hand I can understand that Egypt might want to have a president who's a general, like we once wanted to have George Washington or Andrew Jackson, and in between them there were presidents who were vice presidents or secretaries of state with some political experience. But on the other hand, we're just disillusioned because they had an election between Morsi, who they said was a very bad choice, and Javid, who they didn't seem to like either because he's not running again. And they're redoing the election. Can we trust El-Sisi to talk to the Obama administration about foreign aid and these goals.
Thank you.
So, there's several elephants in the room, and we can't deny the neoliberal economic policies that have plagued Egypt for the past 2 decades through IMF and World Bank, and the structural adjustment policies that have kind of also led to the economic crippling of this moment that is very hard to get out of in certain regards. And then there's also U.S. foreign policy in the region, which is the larger elephant in the room, where we have chosen stability over democracy for several decades. If we think about U.S. national interest, I teach foreign policy. What is our national interest in Egypt? Democracy is not number one, right? It is, right, Camp David, and we saw that in Kerry's statement earlier in April, right? We want to reward Egypt with some 10 Apache helicopters for the maintenance of Camp David. It is flyover rights over the Sinai. It is the maintenance of Suez, and then maybe democracy. And it's not because we're not great, it's because we have strategic interests in the region, just like any sovereign state would. The problem is looking at stability and democracy as two sides of the same coin is no longer the paradigm, because the repression of Mubarak and Sadat before him led to, right, the violence in the prisons and the emergence of terrorism out of a repressive prison system, and also destabilization, right, which became the Arab Spring, which for a few days was very concerning, right, because we didn't know what it was going to turn out. So changing the paradigm of foreign policy as democracy and democracy promotion might be the way to actually get long-term stability, right, decrease in terrorism, and for civil society to believe the signaling game that comes from the United States to the Egyptian people to become credible needs to be reconsidered, because in 2005 the Egyptian street believed that democracy was the only game in town, only to have 2007 come and extreme repression and the curtailing of those democratic values that, right, Condoleezza Rice and President Bush had talked about. And so I think that we need to talk about the greater elephants in the room, right? Neoliberal economic policies and U.S. foreign policy in the region that needs to be considerate of this. The statements out of Washington, last November, earlier this year, last month, and this week are, sometimes contradictory. We want to believe that norms of democratic values, strengthening civil society, freedom of expression, independent media should be the benchmarks to receiving aid, and it's not clear that those are the benchmarks. The fact that, the 10 Apache helicopters that were going to be released were then, well, maybe you guys aren't really meeting the benchmarks. It's not clear who the signaling game is to. Is it to Sisi or is it to the Egyptian street? And in a piece I wrote last week, unfortunately, I think we're losing the Egyptian street on this. Democracy is the only game in town. And that is more dangerous than signaling, is Sisi the right kind of partner for us?
Okay, so I'm going to be a lawyer again. I know it's boring, but I think it's important because this is the response that I get from people in Egypt who are much more optimistic than the tone of our panel. And I should say the most optimistic people I've talked to about Egypt are in Egypt. So that's also important. What they do is they point to the Constitution that was passed just a few months ago, again, in a problematic way, but people are at least believing that this Constitution matters. So here's a couple provisions to just keep in mind, and then ask yourself, one, can they be enforced, and how? And if not, to what extent can we then educate those who are optimistic and saying, if this was the last thing that you were holding on to, you need to at least acknowledge that this really is just paper, ink on a piece of paper. So you do have provisions in the Constitution, Article 55, that protects against due process. And it explicitly says that if you're apprehended or detained or have your freedom restricted, you can't be tortured, terrorized, coerced. You can't be physically or mentally harmed. There is a specific, now that was in the older constitutions as well. Article 52, which is a new provision that says all forms of torture are a crime with no statutes of limitations. So legally, constitutionally, one could sue a police officer for torture, and there's no statute of limitations, no expiration. Of course, the question is evidence. But that was something that the reformists fought very hard for and got. Article 11, which is about the equality of women, this is new, where it says that the government has an obligation to take measures necessary to ensure appropriate representation of women in the Houses of Parliament, of course, as specified by law, so that's the catch. But it also says that they also will be granted the right to hold public posts and high management posts in the state and appointed to judicial bodies without discrimination. Women right now cannot be judges except for as administrative judges, and that was fought hard for and won, I believe it was 2007. And that is a very important issue on gender and judiciary, is getting more women into the judiciary. So now you have a constitutional provision that allows you to do that, which they never did before. Local councils is also something that people are starting to focus on, those who are trying to remain optimistic and say, maybe we're not going to have a lot of influence at the federal level, but maybe at the local level. And Article 180 now requires that at least a quarter of the seats on any local council, a quarter of them must be youth under 35 and a quarter must be women, and at least 50% must be farmers and workers. Now, again, we can become very cynical and say, well, who cares about the local councils? But as a country that prides itself in debating ad nauseum federalism and states versus federal rights and local autonomy, that actually may be an interesting workaround. And then two other things that I think is important is if Sisi does not perform well, and if he doesn't have a parliament that's in his pocket, those are two, well, the first if is going to be an easy one, because I think any president who's taking on Egypt right now is set to fail because the economic problems are so enormous. But if he doesn't have a parliament that's in his pocket, Article 1761 allows the public to get rid of a president without having to do what happened on July 3rd. Through a vote of no confidence. So, in other words, if the House of Representatives decides that the House of Representatives may propose to withdraw confidence from the president, they can file a motion through the majority of members of the parliament. The motion has to be approved by 2/3 of the parliament, and then a public referendum must be conducted. And if a majority of the public say no vote of confidence, the president is out. Now, will that be enforced? I don't know, but at least it's an option and it's available, which it wasn't before. And also, he can only serve for 2 terms, 4 years each. So this Constitution on paper, notwithstanding the problematic way in which it was passed, and by the way, a lot of these provisions, not all, but a lot of them, are what was in Morsi's Constitution as well. So much of the debate about the Constitution was really political as opposed to legal. It was more about process really than it was substance. And so so long as this Constitution is not amended by Sisi and the new parliament the way that Mubarak and the NDP did, and because he can do that, he may just amend the Constitution and change it where suddenly he can have 3 terms, 4 terms, indefinite terms, etc. This is exactly what Mubarak did after every election, was amend the Constitution. Then there is some room for optimism if the law matters. And as a lawyer, I must end and say that the law must matter, or else lawyers and judges should just resign en masse.
I'd really like to thank our panelists, Dr. Fahmy and Professor Aziz, and of course Santiago from the RFK Center for your thought-provoking and very thorough presentations. Very excellent. And I'd also like to thank everyone who came today, as well as the people joining us from the live stream. I greatly apologize for the delay in lunch, but it is now outside, and I invite you to join us for lunch in the reception area. Thank you so much.